So we're now going to focus on funding at a local government level, or more specifically, the case for changing the current model of going cap in hand to the government for funding. Please welcome the President of Local Government New Zealand, Dave Cull.
Okay, thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. My basic thesis today is that the narrow property-based funding system that local government operates under does not incentivise or even in some cases enable investment in much needed either new or renewed infrastructure. And this is holding back our communities. So, is there a case? Well, our challenge is to ensure that councils have the incentives to invest for future social and economic well-being of their communities. Now, all the incentives we have at the moment, or many of them, too often push our councils towards underinvestment, simply because the majority of our funding comes from property rates, and ratepayers want rates to stay low. And you might want to think about what Auckland might have been like today if councillors at the time had been bold enough and enabled enough to support Sir Dovmire Robinson's call for investment in passenger rail. The current menu of funding and financing options doesn't do this well, doesn't incentivise investment. And that need is going to become more pronounced, indeed it is already, as we contemplate future challenges ranging from higher standards expected from central government of our provisions of infrastructure and the pressures of population and visitor growth and the impact of climate change. All of those together are going to require us to invest in a considerable amount more infrastructure or renew some that we already have. And as I say, the enabling financial incentives are not there. Now, the government is fortunately aware of this, and as the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta just some time ago highlighted many of the challenges in her presentation at the Local Government New Zealand conference last month, and it's a list of challenges that many of our members would agree with. That's just a brief snapshot of some of the responsibilities of local government that we have to fund. Now, the Minister did a pretty good job of describing those challenges. At this point, the government's response to this is multifaceted. On the one hand, we're very pleased with the new legislation allowing for the creation of regional petrol taxes and proposals for international levies on tourists. And additionally, we are pushing for the right of councils to develop local accommodation taxes. However, in relation to challenges facing our Three Waters infrastructure, the government has given a clear indication that it's considering, for instance, aggregation options, aggregating water supply and water control. But it'll be fair to say that Local Government New Zealand and the majority of our members are far from enthusiastic, and nor are we convinced that the evidence points to aggregation as a solution to the funding and financing issue. Aggregation of very constrained funding is still likely to be inadequate. We need to change the actual system. Now, these concerns are not new. You'll see that in 2007 there was an inquiry into local government rates, and these are the conclusions that it came to. The sad reality is that we average a rating inquiry about once every 7 years. And you can see that the 2007 inquiry concluded with some conclusions that we could have come to today. They've been the same issues, and if anything, they're just now more urgent. It'd be fair to say that most of these reviews appear to have been designed in the past to soothe and manage concerns about local government funding rather than doing anything about them, because certainly in the past the government hasn't picked up on the recommendations. So we're seriously hopeful that the current Productivity Commission's review announced by Minister Robertson only a month or so back will be different. The issue is the narrow funding base, and it doesn't grow. So we have, as local government, far too much reliance on property rates. In fact, an overwhelming reliance on property taxes, rates. We need a broader tax base. Now, the difference between, and it's important to understand the difference between the tax base that local government has at its disposal and what central government does, and the difference between the two. We have a very narrow funding base and it doesn't grow. It's not buoyant the way the central government tax base does. Buoyant taxes are those that grow as the economy grows. Income tax and GST are both examples of buoyant taxes. And buoyant taxes will increase as a result of government investment, incentivising politicians to invest in infrastructure and services that will have returns in the form of higher tax receipts. This is simply not the case with property taxes. They're not buoyant. So here's a chart of local government's cash or revenue sources. And you'll see there at the top rates, fees and charges. We can, and the strengths and weaknesses of those. They're the funding tools that councils have at their disposal. And the ones apart from rates, fees and charges all have considerable constraints. It's all very fine talking about cost savings, but if you have cost savings, then you're probably going to reduce services. So that's going to run into ratepayer opposition as well. So the immediate problem is a narrow range of funding and financing tools that councils have access to. Now that's appreciating that some councils may not be exploiting all of these tools to their actual potential, but nonetheless, our funding basis is still too narrow, especially when it's seen in an international context. This is a chart of how we compare with other countries. This is the share of total taxes that local government has, and you can see that New Zealand is minuscule compared with some of those countries like Denmark and Sweden. It shows that local government raises a small share of New Zealand's taxes, and that our taxes make up about 2% of gross domestic product. Now, it appears that the Netherlands and the UK are even worse off than we are, but actually there's a big difference with those two countries, and that is that in those two places, local government receives significant financial transfers from central government to make up for their own fundraising. In New Zealand, local government receives no general transfers. We receive co-funding from NZTA that contributes to roading and transport expenditure, and there is the occasional single-purpose grant. But apart from that, we're overwhelmingly reliant on property taxes. This gives you another idea, or another snapshot of about the extent that central government expenditure dominates total government expenditure. And this is an OECD graph from 2009, and it highlights very clearly the degree in New Zealand to which central government controls the bulk of our public revenue and how fiscally centralised we are as a country, and what a small share of our national income local government has to work with, despite the fact that we have considerable demands on local government to invest and provide services, all of which cost money. Now, that shows that the share of central government expenditure as a percentage of total government expenditure is about 87%. 80 years ago, it was 50-50. So it is, over the last 80 years, it has moved even more to the point where New Zealand is one of the most centralised countries in terms of government expenditure in the OECD particularly. And economists refer to this as a case of vertical fiscal inequity. This gives you another idea of how central government tax revenue has grown. So the red line is central government revenue, tax revenue. The blue line is local government revenue. and that shows councils' reliance on property taxes, and it acts as a disincentive. In fact, it's more than a disincentive. The money's simply not there to invest for the future, as well as creating other problems. So you can see again that rising red line is a result of the fact that the taxes that central government collects are buoyant. And as the central government invests and as the economy grows, so the tax take goes up. We understand when government's total tax increases. Councils, on the other hand, are criticised if their rates take grows faster than planned. And in contrast, as this graph shows, central government tax income just keeps on growing. Now this is rates as a share of council revenue. So in general, about 60% of council revenue comes from property rates. There are a few places in the world that rely so much on property taxes. There's South Australia is another one, but they're few and far between. And reliance on a single form of taxation is a problem because it always falls on a single group of taxpayers. So additional forms of tax would share the impact differently among sectors. And you can see why, as our property tax falls on the same group of people, why they are naturally resistant to increasing it. Now, the other thing that we should bear in mind is that 60% has to pay for almost all spending that councils have a choice on. The fees and charges that we take, the other 40%, must pay for what they are charged for. So, for instance, if you're charging for a building consent application, that's part of fees and charges, you have to spend the money on providing the services that that fee is charged for. So you can't use that for general use or for investment in infrastructure in the future. So that 60% is even a little more deceptive because it's expected to do more than 60% of the work. So how do our cities compare? This gives you an idea of the funding lines available to, say, Auckland compared with Paris. And that's another reason for our call for a broader tax base and a greater authority to establish new charges and taxes locally, if we compare those two. So Paris obviously has a wide range of funding tools available, and that means that the impact of revenue increases are more evenly spread over citizens and industries. And if you look at German cities, it's even more, the contrast is even more stark. Now, Paris had a reasonably broad range of funding tools, but nothing compared with the average German city. And these are the revenue options available in a German city, in this case, Berlin. So if we are to incentivise councils to use investments well, then a number of preconditions need to apply. Councils must have access to sources of funding that are commensurate with their responsibilities, and we don't believe that this is the case in New Zealand. We need complementary taxes that are buoyant, that encourage councils to invest, as they will receive greater revenue as they invest. Now, there's still considerable resistance to this. A good example is the struggle we're having to enable councils, for instance, to levy an accommodation levy for visitor infrastructure. All that's trying to do is to recover the costs that ratepayers are putting into providing infrastructure, for instance, for visitors. And on the basis that the people that use the infrastructure should be paying for it, we're advocating for the ability of councils to have an accommodation levy. But there's considerable resistance, not necessarily from central government, but certainly from various stakeholders across the community. There's a lack of understanding that New Zealand isn't unique. The world's not going to collapse when we put in place taxes that are very, very common in other parts of the world. So where are we at? Well, we're very pleased that the government has put in place the Productivity Commission's forthcoming review of local government funding and financing. and we expect that process to be completed by the end of next year. And we're pleased that the government has seen the need for alternative funding models, such as the regional fuel tax and the tourism levy at the border. And it's our hope that the Commission's investigation will provide a solid policy base to argue for new and more appropriate funding options. Most of all, we'll be seeking the general power to enable councils to develop locally specific solutions to their funding constraints. And a first step would be to replace the Local Government Rating Act with the Local Government Revenue Act. So how do we get there? Well, international experience tells us that we need bottom-up changes. And this came from Professor Enid Slack, who heads the Toronto-based Institute for Municipal Governance, and she wrote this a few years ago. It explains in very simple terms why Local Government New Zealand has launched its localism program with a view to enabling councils at a local level and communities at a local level to A, have more say, but B, have more financial options and funding options, because bottom-up change is much more lasting, better targeted and more successful. And that, we believe, is why local government and its funding works best when it is local. Kia ora tātou.
We've got lots of questions for you, so we'll try and get through a couple of them. So why is there such a fear of SPV financing to deliver services? Is there a fear?
Can you explain the acronym?
So SPV would be special project vehicles? Yes. Special purpose vehicles.
Well, I'm not sure that there is a fear or universal fear. With any funding mechanism, you have to, at least before you start, analyse what the unintended consequences might be. But certainly local government would be open to any alternative funding mechanism that achieved the outcomes that we're all wanting, but didn't have unintended negative outcomes. So I don't think there is a fear.
Okay. This person says, you say rates don't grow. Is that a council decision or a legislative restriction in the Rating Act? So I guess they're asking, is that a political decision that rates don't grow, or is that somehow enshrined in law?
I don't think it's specifically enshrined in law, although at times there have been legislative constraints. But more to the point, there is resistance, quite understandable resistance, from ratepayers when their rates rise more, for instance, than the Consumer Price Index. And generally there's a considerable amount of media commentary about that, despite the fact that the local government costs index rises, is quite separate from the Consumer Price Index and rises much faster. But we would be arguing that if we are to rely entirely on rates, they would need to rise much, much faster than even the local government cost index in order to be able to enable us to fund the kinds of things we need. So what we're saying is not that we want to put rates up faster, but that we absolutely need, that system is not sustainable. It's not sustainable to put them up, rates up on that narrow funding base to the extent that they would need to. We need alternatives in addition.
Well, that kind of answers another question here, which was why not just put rates up by nominal GDP, so local government share of GDP is constant, but your point was that that's not enough either.
That's nowhere near enough.
Is an answer to take responsibilities away from councils to free up rates to fund other items, for example, water as a utility rather than a rated service?
That may be the case, and there are situations around the country where, for instance, Wellington has aggregated its, right across the Wellington region has aggregated its water supply. It's working very well. The council's retained ownership of their assets. We know that in Auckland, Watercare provides the service in Auckland, and there are other places where it's volumetrically metered, and that's how you pay for it. So it's an alternative, it's an option, But I guess what we would argue is it's an option for communities to choose how they do it, as long as we meet the standards required of us by the government.
Let's just squeeze in one more, which I personally happen to quite like. Are you pushing for a beer tax like Berlin's, Dave?
No, we haven't specifically, but if we thought it would work, we might.
I think it might get you voted out of office. Please put your hands together for Dave Cull.